talk about temporal dynamics and how they influence ecosystem processes. So when we talk about temporal dynamics, we're talking about the changes or variations in a process or system over time. And it helps to understand the patterns and controls over temporal dynamics of ecosystems. Ecosystems changes are both in response to past changes, but ecosystems can also respond to current environment. And we've seen in ecosystems that historically there's been changes. However, currently humans are dramatically impacting the different environmental conditions, um, which by understanding how ecosystems respond to past change, it can help us try to better understand how ecosystems will respond to current and future changes, particularly with respect to human influences. So another term we want to consider when we're talking about change over time, particularly in ecosystems, is succession. So succession is directional change in an ecosystem composition, structure, and functioning. And we can think about in the first, an ecosystem initially develops, it is going through what we call primary succession, which is the establishment and development of communities and habitats that previously lacked plants and soils. So that's a key term, or key part of the definition for primary succession, is that it lacks any initial plant or soil components. And we might consider some examples where we would see primary succession occurring is something like lava flows, where we've got the lava has killed anything that may or may not be there, or a lava flow is creating new land, sand dunes, receding glaciers. And here's just some pictures of we got a lava flow. We can have an extreme stand replacing fire event, receding glaciers that are exposing bare ground that don't have any real soil development or plants colonized. And then another example is sand dunes here. So in when that new land gets exposed, to begin the process of ecosystem development, we have to have pioneer species. These are the early species. They arrive at a site. They often have traits like they're fast growing. They have long distance dispersal. Remember that if new plants are establishing, the seed has to come from somewhere else. And so often these are plants that have small seeds that are windblown and that are carried through the wind and get deposited, and then they can start establishing. Okay, and here's just an example of what an ecosystem development looks like or may look like over time. So we first get these initial plants establishing from seed source from outside the area, usually seeds that are small and light and windblown. These are often annual plants that can grow very fast in poor conditions that don't need a lot of soil development or nutrients. Over time, as those plants die and some of that plant material gets incorporated into the ground, we start to build some initial properties of soil that allows the conditions to be a little bit better for other plants to colonize, say perennials or grasses. Some of the seed may be brought in by birds and other organisms that come in to eat or utilize the annual plants. Over time, we might get shrubs, and somewhere between the perennial plants and shrubs, we may get plants that have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria to fix nitrogen. So they start to build nitrogen into the soil. As we have talked about in this class, that net primary productivity is usually limited by nutrients, particularly nitrogen. So in order for that ecosystem to provide an environment that larger shrubs and trees can establish, It's going to need to build up nitrogen in the system. So some of those earlier plants are these nitrogen fixers. So here's just kind of a schematic of kind of what some stages of succession. So in primary succession, we're starting out where we have no life and very little soil development, if any. Over time, we go through a pioneer stage where we have pioneer species colonizing. They start to build organic matter in the soil, nutrients, and start to provide a habitat that other plants that in the intermediate stage, often shrubs, can establish. And then in most systems, you may reach what we call a climax stage, which would be like the ecosystem or the biome that we would expect to find, which in often cases can be a forested system. So in your book, they talk about an example from Southeast Alaska in which the study looked at what we call a time for space substitution. So they looked at, we've got a glacier there that's receding over time. So each time a piece of that ground is exposed, we start to get colonization of plants, and then it can keep receding. And so we have different areas in this place in which um, succession has begun. So we can look at the time since the ground was exposed through the glacier receding, and they observed the plant communities at those different time stages. And you can see from the graph, it was like, I think the oldest, the glacier receded in 1760, and then we have 1860, 1907, and 1941. And then they looked at the plant community to help try to understand community ecosystem development over time. And what they found is that in the more recent site, they see a lot of pioneer plants, particularly fireweed. Fireweed is a very common plant found in high elevation, high latitude systems. It tends to grow in very disturbed areas, low nutrient. We get fireweed here in Colorado, and so they start to see at the newer site this fireweed dominating. Over time and a little bit older, we start to get shrubs, often alder. So alder has a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So we start to get nutrients developing in the nutrients building up in the soil. And then they reach a alder stage, so we're like a deciduous plant. Sorry, the driest stage is shrubs. Alder comes next, which is a nitrogen fixer. And then the climax community for many of these systems would be a spruce stage, either a black spruce or a white spruce. So this is one kind of historical study that tried to look at, understand how ecosystems develop over time. And here's just a schematic kind of looking at that same type of ecosystem. So the early stage life history patterns are really important. In the pioneer stage, we start to get dominance by light-seeded species that are seeds that are wind-blown and come into the system and start to establish. And then we see this driest stage, which is dominated by these fast-growing species. We're starting to get a little bit of nitrogen accumulating in the system, a little bit of plant growth, but as the alders come in, these nitrogen fixers, they start to increase the nitrogen content in the soil. As these plants die, their dead plant material gets incorporated in the soil. We start to see buildup of soil organic matter, an increase in overall plant growth and net primary productivity. We start to see an increase in plants that have associations with mycorrhizae, which can help with nutrient and water acquisition. And then in the more climax type stage, we see the system dominated by very long living trees, and it becomes a spruce forest. when we think about temporal dynamics and ecosystem development over time, I talked a little bit about how that might influence nutrient cycling. I'm going to touch on that a little bit more now. So nutrient dynamics during succession are both a cause and a consequence of the dynamic interplay between net primary productivity and decomposition. So early on, the parent material that in which soil is developed from is low in nitrogen. Remember, we talked about that most of the nitrogen is in the atmosphere in a gas form that plants can't use. And for it to build up into plant material in the soil, it's got to be fixed by bacteria. And then it's got to be turned over, it's taken up by plants, and then cycled what we call internally within the ecosystem through the process of decomposition, nitrification, etc. So early on, we've got low nitrogen in these ecosystems as they're during early development. And because we have low nitrogen, we know that plants need nitrogen. It's a main component of the enzymes needed in photosynthesis. So nitrogen can limit plant carbon uptake or net primary productivity during primary succession. However, over time, that as we start to get fixers and build up a nitrogen, the nitrogen can accumulate in the vegetation and soil over time. So younger ecosystems tend to have lower nitrogen availability than older ecosystems. Nitrogen increases within the system because of the presence and establishment of nitrogen fixers. Internal nitrogen cycling increases in mid and late succession. So internal, we're talking about the nitrogen is in the system and it's just being cycled between plants taking it up, litter fall, decomposition, mineralization, nitrification, and then again plant uptake. So mid to late succession, the nitrogen inputs are roughly equal to the nitrogen outputs. And here's just a little example of what that might look like. So at the top of this figure, we have the plant composition over time as the ecosystem develops. On the bottom graph, we have nitrogen concentration in the soil, and it's separated in the red by what's at the forest floor and what's actually getting incorporated in the mineral soil. And as you can see, early on, we have very low nitrogen concentrations in the soil, and then those concentrations increase kind of mid to late succession. And we talked earlier when we were talking about nutrient dynamics, we talked about this historic study in Hawaii that looked at nitrogen and phosphorus limitation over time. And what they found is in the younger soil sites, or when they added nitrogen, they saw an increase in plant growth, suggesting that younger sites tend to be more nitrogen limited. So just now to think about another nutrient that's really important for plant growth, and that's phosphorus. So the parent material generally is higher in phosphorus, so opposite of nitrogen. We know that phosphorus can limit net primary productivity during late succession. Phosphorus accumulates in vegetation and soils over time, and it can get occluded to mineral soil. When it's occluded, it's less available for plants. Phosphorus can get leached from the system. It's an anion, so it doesn't get adhere to soil particles as much, which are negatively charged. And then over time, we actually see a decrease in available phosphorus. And here's the Walker-Sayers model. So this was their hypothesis for looking at how phosphorus in an ecosystem over time. So early in the ecosystem development and soil development, we have high phosphorus content. We lose phosphorus in that system from leaching, and then what phosphorus is there can be tied up in organic matter and also occluded to soil mineral and become unavailable. So over time, in older systems, phosphorus is more limiting net primary productivity. And again, that test in Hawaii by Vitusik and Barrington also demonstrated that, where they added phosphorus to young, intermediate, and old soils and found a larger response in plant growth when adding phosphorus in the older soils. So that suggests that plant growth and net primary productivity is actually limited more by phosphorus in older soils. So how does carbon balance change over time during ecosystem development? So when we first start in primary succession, if we just have bare ground with no plant material or a little organic matter, we have low carbon inputs, so low net primary productivity because we just don't have that much plant material. And then over time, as plants establish, there's more carbon uptake, higher NPP, and then as that plant material starts to decompose, we'll see higher heterotrophic respiration. And we start to see that increase sort of mid-succession. And then net primary productivity also increases with nitrogen fixer colonization as that nitrogen accumulates in the system that allows for more plant carbon uptake, more photosynthesis, and thus more net primary productivity. However, in forested systems, we can see a decline in net primary productivity in late succession as the plant community kind of reaches its maximum leaf area and all kind of the spots have been taken. We don't really have space for new colonization, and we kind of reach what they call a steady state. So here's some other more detailed look at the carbon balance over time. So we have a bunch of graphs that have come from your textbook. On the left, those graphs are representing the carbon pool and carbon flux in primary succession. And we haven't quite yet talked about secondary succession, but the right happens when we have secondary succession, which occurs after a large disturbance event. So let's just look at the primary succession for right now. We see that soil carbon and plant carbon are low in early succession, and then they start to accumulate and reach some type of plateau in late succession. NPP and net ecosystem production, again, are low. So is heterotrophic respiration. Low early succession, they kind of reach their peak or their highest point mid to late succession, and then late succession they start to reach a plateau. So net primary productivity recovers more quickly than in secondary succession than in primary succession due to rapid colonization and high growth rate of herbs, grasses, and resprouting perennials. So if we look at the secondary succession, again, secondary succession occurs when we've got some type of a disturbance event that opens up some of the system, and we have some bare ground, but we still have some live plant material to work with. So following secondary succession, we still have some plant and soil carbon in there, depending on the type of disturbance. We could have lost more, like in a fire, we could have lost more carbon in the plant material than in below ground. But then we start to accumulate at a faster rate carbon within the system following secondary succession. So another aspect important to think about are trophic dynamics. So early primary succession, herbivory tends to be low because there's low food density. There's not very many plants. There's not a whole lot to eat. Also, if there's not that many plants, for herbivores, there's not really a lot of places to hide from predators. So they're more vulnerable if they're grazing or eating in an early succession ecosystem. There's also insufficient canopy to create a humid environment that is favorable for invertebrate herbivores. So herbivory is greater in early to mid-secondary succession due to rapid growing herbaceous and shrubs. So if we already have an ecosystem established and let's say we have a fire come in, often some plants survive that fire, so the regrowth can happen more quickly. Shrubs often can resprout after fire. So again, we see more quick growth of plants following secondary succession. So there's more available for those herbivores. Also, in early growth, plants tend to be higher in nitrogen and they have lower carbon defenses, so they're more susceptible to herbivory. We see lower herbivory during late succession as plants shift allocation from growth, so nitrogen in there because of their photosynthesizing, to more defense, which makes them less palatable for herbivory. There are some exceptions to that. For example, in late succession, some trees can get weakened by environmental stress, say like a drought or a heat event, that can make them more susceptible to insect outbreak. And in that case, we might see higher herbivory in late succession. Another thing to consider is that large herbivores can actually keep an ecosystem in mid-succession, and so it never quite reaches what we might consider a climax community. And an example is like in the savannas, where we have large herbivores like elephants that eat or break down the shrub or the woody plants, so they keep that system in a grassland system, and it never quite gets to a forest system. So, if a plant community reaches its height, it's considered a climax community, and that would correspond to the biome for that we would expect for that vegetation type. So climate plus other factors is actually the ultimate determination of the endpoint community type. And with your guys' biome project, you learned a lot about the climatic factors that can influence where we see different biomes. Also, soils, topography, fire, animals they all introduce variation in the establishment of that climax community. So in some cases, if we have frequent fires or animal disturbance, that community might never quite get to that climax community. And here's just an example, again, of like hypothesized community or ecosystem development, where you reach, here we've started with the pioneer community. Often even before vascular plants colonize, we get colonization of lichen and mosses, and then over time, grasses, herbs, shrubs, trees, seedlings. Then you might get some kind of deciduous mixed conifer, and then more dominated, like larger plants of here, in this example, spruce, fir, or birch. Again, this is a very temperate zone example. This would look a little different in the tropics or in other ecosystem types. So the climax community can take many years to develop depending on disturbance type. So if that system keeps experiencing different disturbances, that can delay it reaching that climax community. And just for example, for timelines, it's estimated like an oak hickory forest in the south might take 100. It might take from initial primary succession 150 years to reach in a climax community. In contrast, in the western United States, a grassland system might only take 20 to 40 years. A tropical forest might take about 100 years. And then these beech maple forests that we might see in like the Midwest can take about 1,000 years. So I talked a little bit about disturbance, so I want to kind of focus on that a little bit more, of the role of disturbance in succession. So disturbance is a major cause of long-term fluctuations in structure and function in ecosystem. And we see disturbance as a natural part of an ecosystem. And it's needed for building the ecosystem and for influencing ecosystem processes. So technical definition from your textbook for disturbance is the relative discrete event in time that removes plant biomass, alters structures of populations, communities, and ecosystems, and causes changes in resource availability or the physical environment. And I just wanted to point out that if we're thinking about succession and biodiversity, um, the highest biodiversity isn't often seen in that climax community, but in the intent, so the intensity of a disturbance can influence the biodiversity. So we see that with if we have an ecosystem we are very we don't see disturbance that much, so low frequency of disturbance, we tend to have a low biodiversity. In contrast, in an ecosystem that sees a high frequency of disturbance, we can also have a low um, biodiversity. So where we see the highest biodiversity is an intermediate level of disturbance. So some disturbance is important because disturbance can open up spaces for colonization of new plants. So you think of a dense tropical forest. If we get a tree that dies and falls to the ground, it opens up a light gap that can allow colonization of new plants. And again, in a fire system, we might see an intermediate disturbance or a medium intensity fire that doesn't burn everything, but it burns patches. Those patches are now available. They've removed the competition and can be now available for colonization of new species. And so I just wanted to show some examples of disturbance. So this is an insect outbreak, a beetle bark outbreak here in Colorado. Here's an example of flooding, can be another major disturbance. Hurricanes or tornadoes can also be another disturbance. And then I wanted to show you this one. This is actually a picture I took myself in northern Alaska. So this is a 1 year following a stand replacing fire of black spruce. So in this case, the fire was so intense that it burned and killed all of the above ground vegetation. And what we see 1 year later colonizing in the understory is fireweed. So we can think of that as an early colonizer species. And then here's an example. We can also have disturbances through invasion of non-native species. So this is an example of cheatgrass invading into a ecosystem in the western part of the United States. Cheatgrass invasions can alter the ecosystem properties and actually lead to long-term changes that make it harder for the native plants to establish or to do well in that system. So now I talk a little bit, I already kind of mentioned secondary succession, but we're going to talk a little bit more about secondary succession. So secondary succession is the regeneration of plant communities following disturbance. So we might be at any stage in the succession process, and then we can have a disturbance, and then what's followed, the community development following that is called secondary succession. Again, I mentioned some disturbances already. You can have fire or windstorms, animal burrows or other disturbances, tree falls, etc. So here's kind of what can happen at any, often in the pioneer stage, but it could also happen in the intermediate stage where we have an agent of change, which is some type of disturbance. So in this example, we have a disturbance happening during the pioneer stage, and then what's left, there is some life still available. So either some things didn't get burned completely, or they've got their above ground got burned, but they still have some below ground live material, or like a shrub, they could resprout. So we have some life. And so what's following is we don't go all the way back to primary succession because we do have some life there. Then we go into what we call secondary succession. However, sometimes a disturbance can lead to such a dramatic alteration of the ecosystem that we can't, it's very challenging to ever go back to that original ecosystem. The environment, the soil conditions have changed so much. And what I was showing here, we can have what we call ecological transition. So the original community is replaced by a different type of community following disturbance. So this video, these photos are from the Southwest Arizona in a experimental range called the Santa Rita Experimental Range. It's just south of Tucson, Arizona. So in the early 1900s, people came out west and they were very surprised to see this very luscious desert grassland system. So they had this great idea of like, let's bring lots of cows out here and this graze. Like, it's amazing. This like all these grasses. So in conjunction with too overgrazing, so too many cattle for too long in a smaller space, plus a series of drought conditions that put the plant community at stress, it led to a loss of the grassland communities, a lot of open ground, and what happened is shrubs like mesquite started colonizing what was historically a desert grassland system. So it's a little hard to see, but up here, these are mesquite shrubs, and you can see and these are paired photos from the same region. In 1900, we had this desert grassland system. We start to see a transition, and in the early 2000s, we see shrubs, a lot more cacti, and a lot more bare ground. And so early on, when they started noticing this, there was a lot of research put into trying to come up with the best like stocking rates, like how many cows per unit area for how long, to help minimize the negative impact. And over like the last 100 years, they've done all these different studies and different management strategies to try to bring back the desert grasslands, like doing shrub removal, seeding, and what they found, in many cases, it's almost impossible to go back to a desert grassland system. The ecosystem has been altered so much. And so it's suggested in this type of system that the system has transitioned from what was historically a desert grassland system to a shrub-dominated system. And we have examples like this in many different ecosystems. This can happen with a invasion of a non-native. For example, cheatgrass is a highly invasive grass introduced in the western part of the United States. It's highly flammable. It has actually altered the fire regime, which has led in many cases to changes in the ecosystem that make it hard now for native plants to develop. And then on later this week, I will read more about fires in Alaska and what that means for potentially seeing a transition in forest types. All right, so just to go back, I want to point out that disturbance can happen at any stage along this successional pathway. So we could have a major disturbance early in pioneer stage. That disturbance could be so intense that it could actually lead to no life. And so that we, in some cases, are actually going back to more of a primary succession. We can also have disturbances at the intermediate stage and the climax stage. Again, if the disturbance leaves some life, then we're going to be in secondary succession. But if this disturbance is so severe that there's no life remaining, then we would go back to a primary succession type scenario.